So here we are once again in Microsoft Flight Simulator at the default Barton Aerodrome. That's Echo Golf Charlie Bravo, which is near Manchester in the UK, to look at another add-on aeroplane for Microsoft Flight Simulator, which, as I'm recording this, was released yesterday, and that is the aeroplane that you see in front of you, which is the Nieuport 17, which is a First World War fighter. Now, this is from developer Big Radials. Now, if you've watched reviews on my channel before, you'll know that I've reviewed a Microsoft Flight Simulator add-on from Big Radials before, and that was their Curtiss P40B. So if you want to check that review out, that's on my channel, and I recommend you do because that's a very, very nice add-on. Now, a bit about the developer. Big Radials is two very, very talented developers with quite a bit of experience in modeling and making add-ons for various versions of Flight Simulator and what have you, and they got together with the intention of making old prop planes for Microsoft Flight Simulator. So they joined together and started their own little development company called Big Radials. Now, don't be fooled by the name. Even though it's called Big Radials, they're making prop planes with more than just radial engines. It's just kind of a good name. So the Curtiss P40B obviously doesn't have a radial engine, and that was their first stab at making something for Microsoft Flight Simulator. They have other stuff in the pipeline, but this one that you can see in front of you, this Nieuport 17, is a little sort of side project. It's not kind of their main development line. And this doesn't have a radial engine either, despite appearances. It has a rotary engine. More on that if you're not familiar with the difference as we progress. Now, a little bit about the actual product itself. So that's about the developer. Very impressive they are. The product itself, I will put a link in the description below where you can go to the Big Radials website and purchase this thing if you are interested in it, where you will find that it is 25 Australian dollars. Now, if you're not familiar with Australian dollars, if you're more US dollars or pound sterling or euro and what have you, 25 Australian dollars translates to about £13 sterling, so that would be 12 euros and maybe about $10, maybe a little bit more in US dollars. So that's kind of the price you're looking at. So not very expensive at all. Now, full disclosure here, I did not buy this this add-on. This is a review copy that they sent to me. It's not very often that I get review copies of things, but when I do get review copies of things, what I do is I donate the cost of the product to a charity, usually Guide Dogs for the Blind in the UK. So even though I essentially got this for free, I end up sort of doing a charitable donation for the equivalent money, which means that what that kind of does conscience-wise to me means that, you know, I've still kind of spent the amount of money, which means that I am honest with my reviews. So trust me, even though this is a review copy, if this thing sucks, I will say so. If, on the other hand, it's great, you can trust me. I'm not just saying that because I got a review copy. Anyway, with all that out of the way, yeah, Big Radials Nieuport 17, as you can see, a very, very nice model of what I think what most people would regard as a kind of cliche First World War fighter. You know, when people think First World War fighter, there's probably got a picture in their head of something like this, because it was one of the really, really sort of well-known fighters of World War One. And it's a very nice model. It stands up to very close inspection. It's got some nice animation touches on it. For example, you can see the flight leader streamer there blowing in the wind. When we get this thing in the air, you'll see that the aviator scarf will be blowing in the wind as well. The engine and all that kind of stuff's animated, so it's a rotary engine, so it spins round, and that stands close inspection as well. If we have a close look at it, you can see very, very nice texturing on the propeller. Very nice texturing indeed. Good detail of the nuts on the propeller bus holding the propeller on, and then good detail of the rotary engine on the thing. This is a, if I'm not mistaken, it's either a Lerone or a Gnome rotary engine. These were really, really common on particularly early First World War fighters. The Germans had the Oberrösel, which was a kind of equivalent of this thing, very, very similar. If you're not familiar with rotary engines, how they actually work is rather than the propeller being on a crankshaft that spins round, the propeller is actually bolted to the engine, and the engine itself spins round a stationary crankshaft that is bolted to the bulkhead. So the crankshaft is bolted to the bulkhead that you can see behind the engine. The entire engine spins round, and the propeller is attached to the engine, so that spins round as well. What that means is that because the engine is spinning around really fast, it gets very, very well cooled, and it also means that the fuel can be fed to the cylinders using centrifugal force, as can the lubrication oil. The disadvantage of that is that you've got a dirty great big lump of metal spinning round at very, very high speed, and that acted a bit like a gyroscope. So, you know, it would make First World War planes turn a little bit better in one direction than they did in the other. Decent pilots would use that to their advantage. The other disadvantage of it is when you've got something spinning round that fast and it's like spraying oil all over the place, despite the fact there's a cowling around the engine, these things would spit out castor oil all over the place. And if you know anything about castor oil, you will know that that can sort of promote bowel movements. So there were a lot of First World War pilots who were, let's put it this way, their bowels were a bit loose because they were taking in castor oil all the time and what have you. So that's your rotary engine. It spins around. Looks like a radial engine, but the entire thing spins around. We'll see that when we start the thing up. Anyway, you can see that that's very, very nice detail on the engine. Now, there are some exterior details on this that you can add, some kind of whistles and bells, like you can have chocks display. Be a bit difficult to see them in the long grass, so I'm not going to worry about that too much, but trust me, they are there. And then you've got a little oil can there when you parked up on the ground. Now, the nice detailing of this thing continues on the inside. So, on the inside, pretty basic, like most First World War aeroplanes. However, there are some whistles and bells on it. So we've got a gun up top, that is a Lewis gun, and then we've got a Vickers gun behind this windshield, and these can both be operated. So you can fire the gun if you want to, and you can see the drum magazine rotating around on the Lewis gun, or you can fire on the Lewis gun, or you can fire the Vickers gun. Like that. Now, you probably saw the cocking lever moving backwards and forwards on that Lewis gun. If you didn't, there it is. Now, these guns were prone to jamming in cold temperatures, and if they got a feed jam from the ammunition. So what a lot of First World War pilots would do is they would carry a big spanner or a hammer or something like that, so that they could smack the cocking lever and unjam the gun if it jammed. And you can do this in the sim if you want to. You can use the hammer and you can smack on there and what have you, and fix that to fix a jam. There you go. You can open and close the windshield, as we can see. And then there are also some other nice details in here. So if you're wondering why there's a hammer in the cockpit, that's why there's a hammer in the cockpit. Now there's a little checklist clipboard thing here that you can click on to expand. Now, I'm sure you're aware in Microsoft Flight Simulator that anything that appears on the Microsoft Flight Simulator built-in store cannot have weaponry showing on it. Now, that would mean that this would be precluded from being sold on the Microsoft Flight Simulator store. It's got weapons on it because you buy it from the Big Radials website, and I will put a link in the description below to where you get that. But they may possibly want to put it on the Microsoft Flight Simulator built-in market at some point. So what they've done is they've put an option on here where you can show or hide the guns. So you can click on there, and all of the guns, that's the Vickers gun on the cowling and the Lewis gun up on the mount up top, can be hidden. Yeah, like that. So that's what that's about. You've got show hide radios. Now over on the right hand side, it's all traditional and there's no radio showing there, but you might want to use this in the sim and use a transponder and use ATC. So if you click that thing there, you get a very, very basic radio with a transponder, nav and comm on there. Not very, very sophisticated, but good enough to do ATC and stuff like that. So you can hide that if you want to. You've got this thing where I'll give you show kilometers per hour airspeed. You've got this thing here where you can show or hide the chocks. Now, so when we click on that and we look on the external view, bit difficult to see at the moment, but in the long grass there, if I boom hit that, and we go on there, there will be some chocks. I think I can just about make them out there and there. So yes, there are chocks, but they're not showing up very well in that long grass. And then last but not least, show checklist, where you can actually have a checklist on view. Now it's a bit difficult to see in the brightness settings that I've got there, but it's got a checklist for starting the thing up, and then it's got typical sort of rotation speeds, stall speeds, cruise speeds, and all that kind of stuff. So pretty basic, but you know, good enough to get you going. Now on the subject of that, when you buy this thing, trying to start the engine there. When you buy this thing, for your 25 Australian dollars or 13 quid or what have you, which I didn't pay because it's a preview version, what you get is you get this aeroplane, the Nieuport 17, with I think there's about 3 or 4 different paint jobs with it, but don't worry about that because painters are going to have at this thing like crazy because it's very, very pretty, and there are a lot of different paint schemes that it will. You also get a PDF manual. It's not massive, I think it's about 20 pages, but it covers everything that you need to know about flying this plane, plus some tips on controls that you might want to mess around with. There is one control that you might want to assign in your simulator. More on that when we get the thing in the air. So the PDF manual is short but to the point and very nicely written. It's got a little bit of history about the plane as well. Now, carrying on, so that's your checklist thing. That's your little hammer for unjamming the gun. There's the throttle lever on there, like that, which you can move forwards or backwards. There is the mixture lever, which you can move forwards or backwards. Forwards is fully rich. There are magneto switches here, which if you flick them up, that's on. There is a fuel valve there, which when it's across is closed, and when it's in line is open. Like that. There is obviously your firing handle for your gun, and that thing up there where you can fire, where you press on the trigger. You have ailerons, elevators, and rudder pedals animated. And instrument wise, what you've got is pretty basic, like most First World War aeroplanes. So you've got an airspeed indicator, an altimeter, an RPM gauge, a clock, and a compass, and that's it. Although you can actually tilt that compass, so you can have it view a little bit more towards you if you want to. So that's a very nice touch. And the only other thing that we need to look at is you can open or close the windshield. Now, you can actually start this thing by clicking on the propeller. You can see there we've got open, close windshield, but if you open that, you can get to a sort of starter button where you can start the engine like that. Now you can actually start this thing with Control E if you want to, but it's the fact that you can sort of click on the propeller is kind of alluding to the fact that that to start this thing, what you would have had is you would have had someone take the switches off on the magneto. Someone would swing the propeller through to suck some fuel into the cylinders, and then you'd go switches off, and someone would swing the propeller, they'd get clear, and then you'd turn the magnetos on, and hopefully the momentum of the propeller would make the engine fire. Now, another bit about First World War airplanes that some people aren't familiar with. Some First World War airplanes had inline stationary engines that were water cooled. Planes like the Royal Aircraft Factory SE5, the SPAD, the Fokker D7, the Airco DH4 and DH9. These things had inline stationary engines which were water cooled, and those things had proper carburetors on them so they could have a proper throttle. Aircraft like this, the Nieuport 17, and other aircraft similar to it, so Sopwith Camel, Fokker DR1 triplane, Sopwith triplane, things like that with that rotary engine on there. They had a very, very basic carburetor, but it was difficult to have a full-on carburetor arrangement with it because the entire engine is spinning around, so it's a bit difficult to feed fuel to it. So what tended to happen was the fuel was fed via centrifugal force, but from the reservoir what you can do is you can sort of change the flow of the fuel. So it's, although a lot of First World War airplanes that didn't that had a rotary engine on them didn't have a particularly fancy carburetor, they did have a carburetor of some description, which is why you can have a throttle on a First World War aeroplane with a rotary engine. However, what most aeroplanes in World War One with a rotary engine tended to do was, instead of using the throttle to slow down, what they would do is they would have something called a blip switch on the control column. Now, some of them had a really basic blip switch on them. Others had a more sophisticated one with 2 or 3 buttons. And what a blip switch would do is, in its most basic form, it would cut off the ignition so that there was no spark going to the engine. And what that would do is you would hit the blip switch, the spark would stop going to the engine, and the engine would stop firing, and the propeller would act like a big brake, and that would slow the engine down. But before the engine completely slowed down, you'd hit the blip switch again, the ignition would come back on, and hopefully, because your propeller was still spinning, your aeroplane would then engine would then start up again. And that's how they tended to sort of speed up and slow down, by doing that. On more sophisticated aeroplanes with a blip throttle, like for example the Fokker DR1, what they tended to have was tended to have a few blip switches on them, and what they could do is they could cut the electrical power to certain cylinders. Now, most rotary engines, including this one, had 9 cylinders, so what you would find is that some blip switches if you pressed it, it'd cut out maybe the 1st cylinder, the 3rd cylinder, and the 5th cylinder around the circle, and the 7th cylinder, and what have you. So they'd kind of balance it out a little bit so the thing didn't go completely out of balance from cutting off the spark to some of the engines. Spark plugs. And the more sophisticated ones would let you cut maybe 3 sparks to 3 cylinders, or 5 sparks, or maybe 7 sparks, and what have you. So you had kind of different blip throttle settings. Now, if you've ever seen any World War One films, or you've been to an air show and seen a genuine World War One vintage aeroplane flying with a rotary engine on it, you've probably heard the sound of it coming in for a landing, where you'll hear the engine. I'll do my best to impersonate it. You'll hear like that, where the engine sounds like it's cutting out and starting again. That is the pilot hitting the blip switch, stopping the engine and starting it. You've probably seen that in movies and stuff like that. So that's what that sound is. And you can replicate that in the Microsoft Flight Simulator with this Nieuport 17. However, to do that, what there is an ignition toggle switch in the options of the simulator. So what you would do is you would hit there like that, and you would go to the control options, and you can do this. So I'm going to show you there on my T-Flight HOTAS. I'm going to hit search by input, and I'm going to hit that switch there, and you can see toggle master ignition switch, which I've got on that button there on my T-Flight HOTAS. Yeah, that I'm using as the blip switch. So if you're getting this thing, go into your simulator options, because this isn't assigned by default, and go and find toggle master ignition switch and assign either a key to it, or a button on your joystick, or what have you, so that what you can do is you can blip the throttle, because then you will be able to fly this a little bit more authentically. As I say, there is a throttle on it that you can use, but if you want to go full on World War One authentic, that's what you're going to need to use. Yeah, and it's also useful because First World War aeroplanes did not have wheel brakes. Yeah, what they would typically do is they would slow down. They didn't taxi very well either, because most of them didn't have a tail wheel. They had a tail skid. So usually what you'd have is you'd have people run up to the thing when it landed or when it was taxiing out, and they'd grab hold of the wing tips on the thing, and they'd help steer it on the ground. Yeah. So in order to get this thing to the runway, we might have to be a little bit careful taxiing it. Of course, First World War airplanes usually would fly off just big convenient fields, so they didn't tend to have runways in the sense that we have runways now. What you would do is you would just kind of taxi onto the field, and whichever way the wind was blowing, you'd turn into the wind and you'd take off. And that was how it worked, really, you know what I mean? So that's why nobody can really say what the crosswind limit is on early aeroplanes before there were runways on airfields, because they didn't tend to have to deal with crosswinds because they would always land into the wind. It was only when, you know, more sophisticated airplanes that needed longer runways started tipping up that they had to start building airports with runways and stuff like that. Things like this just tended to go off a big field and what have you. So we can get this thing round now. So you can see I wouldn't worry too much about that, because what I am doing is I'm taxing it with the throttle and not the blip switch. But if I hit the blip switch, what we'll see is this. So I'm hitting the blip switch now, and then I hit it again before the propeller stopped, and it picked up again. That's typically how you do it. Now, because we're going, you can see that the aviator scarf is blowing in the wind and the streamer is blowing a little bit, but we're not going very fast, so the streamer's not flicking out a little bit. If I was being really picky, when this thing's flying along at a fair rate of knots, I think it'd look a little bit better if those flapped about really quickly. That's about the only thing that I could pick on it visually, and that's just kind of a personal preference. Anyway, let's get this thing in the air. So we'll go in the cockpit like that, and we'll tilt the view up a little bit, and then I'll pull it back so you can see the control inputs that I'm making here. And so there we go, throttling up, and then I'm going to get the tail wheel up, so I'm pitching forward a little bit on the stick, and then up we go. So not very hard to take off, but like the real thing, and like a lot of World War I aeroplanes, it's a little bit tail heavy. You do kind of have to trim it up a little bit, which you can do. And the reason that a lot of First World War airplanes were tail heavy is that in the First World War, engine technology was internal combustion engine technology was fairly primitive compared to what it is like these days. They didn't have a lot of sophisticated aluminium alloys and stuff like that to make engine blocks out of. Most engines were sort of milled out of a dirty, great big block of steel with a cast iron casing on them, so they weighed a lot. That was one of the reasons why the rotary engine was quite popular, because it's not actually very long. So if you actually look from the kind of side view, the engine isn't very long, and what they were able to do, even though the engine was very heavy, was mount it really close to the wing. Because if they'd had a dirty, great big metal engine sticking out a long way, the thing would have tipped onto its nose. So they tended to have to mount them well back. And First World War airplanes with a stationary water-cooled engine tended to have a little bit of a longer tail sticking out and more weight on them and what have you. So what this meant was that because the engine was very close to the wing, and it provided a big sort of gyroscopic force with the engine spinning round, this thing would turn on a sixpence, yeah, especially in one direction if it was using the gyroscopic force of the engine to assist it. Now that's why airplanes like this tend to roll in one direction, and you have to sort of like apply a bit of aileron and rudder to them to get them to fly straight. And it is kind of the fun of flying one of those things. So there you go. Anyway, while we're in the air, a little bit about the real aeroplane. So the first flight of a powered aeroplane, as everyone knows, even though there are some arguments about it, was the Wright brothers in 1903 at Kitty Hawk. But it was only about sort of 8 years later that aeroplanes were capable of doing about 100 miles an hour. You know, so development of airplanes was very swift at that point. And Nieuport, French aircraft manufacturer, in 1911 were making racing aeroplanes that could do 100 miles an hour. They were a really sophisticated aircraft manufacturer, but their aircraft that went that kind of speed were monoplanes, and there was kind of a belief that monoplanes, because there was only one wing on the thing, they'd be very much faster, and that's true because there's less drag and what have you. But a lot of pilots didn't trust monoplanes because the box structure of a biplane is inherently a bit more self-bracing and what have you. So combat aeroplanes, they tended to favour biplanes. And in fact, the British, with combat aeroplanes, actually banned monoplanes. That's why you don't see any Royal Flying Corps monoplanes, really. You know, I mean, they're all biplanes and what have you, because they actually banned monoplanes because they didn't trust them. And that ban actually stayed in place until 1934 in the UK. And what's it? The aircraft manufacturers, when they were looking at building stuff for the Second World War, like the Hurricane and the Spitfire, actually had to argue to be able to produce monoplanes such as the Spitfire and the Hurricane, because that there was still this belief that biplanes are better and all that lot. And what have you. So it's kind of an interesting one. So anyway, back with the story. Nieuport were making racing aeroplanes, and as I say, in 1911 they had racing aeroplanes that that were capable of 100 miles an hour. So very, very impressive. But there was an aircraft trophy competition that Nieuport wanted to enter, which you've probably heard of from the expression Gordon Bennett. Yeah, that was the Gordon Bennett Trophy. Yeah, which is an aviation competition. And the rules of that competition that Nieuport wanted to enter were that it was there were a few things that they were looking for the winning airplane. One was, it had to be able to fly very, very fast, and Nieuport could certainly build very, very fast airplanes. But one of the other things that it needed to do for the competition was demonstrate the ability to fly slow as well. Yeah. Now, of course, if you want an aeroplane to fly slow, then what is more useful is two wings, because you're creating more lift. And so what the designer at Nieuport thought was, well, how about having 1.5 wings instead of 2 wings or 1 wings? We can have the best of both worlds. It'll not create as much drag, so the thing will be fast, and it will have a wing to help it. Now, 1.5 wings, sesquiplane, because you've got monoplane with a single wing, biplane with 2 wings, and sesquiplane 1.5 wings. So when we look at the wings on this, the upper wing is a standard biplane wing, but the lower wing is about half the width of it. So it's got 1.5 wings. Now that does 2 things. If we look at it, you can see there's your sesquiplane configuration. Big wing on the top, half the chord of the wing on the lower wing, and that was what enabled the Nieuport 17 to be maneuverable, because it had 2 wings, but also fairly fast for the time. And what they were really, what the designers were really sort of grasping for when they came up with that concept was what we would do these days, which would be have flaps and slats on a wing, so that you get a wing to create lift, but you've got another sort of like little wing to create some extra lift. So it was, before they had the capability of having lots of moving parts on a wing, it was a solution very, very similar to putting slats and flaps on something. And the other advantage of it is that because you've not got a very, very big wing, what you've also got is the ability to look over the side and have your visibility not really obscured by a dirty great big wing. So that was another advantage to it. So that was in 1911, 1912, when Nieuport were designing that aeroplane that was kind of like a cross between a monoplane and a biplane. And very, very successful it was. But of course, it wasn't long until the First World War came along. That started in 1914, and so the aeroplanes that Nieuport had built very quickly got taken up and used as warplanes in the First World War. Now, anyone who knows anything about the First World War will know that the advantage switched between sides as one side developed a plane that was slightly better than the other, and then the other side countered it with one that they created, and blah, 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 blah. And the first one that really made a big showing in the First World War was the Fokker-Eindecker, which pilots such as Oswald Bolger and Max Immelmann made a name for themselves on. and lots of unfortunate Allied pilots were shot down by it because it was the first aeroplane with a synchronizing interrupter gear, so it could fire a machine gun forward, and that was a big advantage. And for a while, the Allies really struggled to fight against that. But the Nieuport plane that had been built that was very, very maneuverable with this sesquiplane arrangement, Nieuport created a single-seater fighter version of it, which went into service in January of 1916. And that, because it was so small and so maneuverable, it was the Nieuport 11 Baby, or Babe. And that was a really, really successful aeroplane. But because they didn't have an interrupter gear at the time, what they did was they put a Lewis gun up there so it would fire over the propeller arc. But after a while, they figured out an interrupter gear, so they put a Vickers gun that could fire through the machine gun arc. Now, as good as the Nieuport 11 was, they could make it better, so they made another version with a slightly larger wing, and then another one with an ever so slightly larger wing, and that was the Nieuport 17, which is this aeroplane here. And there were a few problems with it initially because it had a variable incidence wing and only one spar on it, so it could get flutter, and the wings could sometimes get damaged, or even in really, really high speed dives it could shed the lower wings and stuff like that. But generally speaking, the Nieuport 17 was a really impressive aeroplane, and certainly one of the best aeroplanes of the early period of the First World War. So the Nieuport 11 went into service at the start of 1916, and the Nieuport 17, this aeroplane, first flew at the start of 1916 and went into service about 3 months later. So this was kind of like an early war, very impressive First World War airplane, and it was so impressive that the Germans actually copied it. Several German airplanes. One was an absolute direct copy of it, which was I think made by Siemens Schuckert, and then Albatros put a sesquiplane wing on their Albatros D3 to become the Albatros D5, and Pfalz made the Pfalz D3 with a sesquiplane wing. They actually improved it a little bit because they had 2 spars on it, so it was a little bit better in terms of countering flutter and stuff like that. So yeah, this was a really, really successful aeroplane. Now, performance-wise, this thing can make it up to about 17,000 feet. It will take a while to get up there. Climbing up to about maybe 8,000 feet, it can probably do maybe 1,000 feet per minute climb rate. After that, it might take a while to get up to its ultimate service ceiling, which would be about 16,000 feet. It's dependent on the weight of the pilot. But yeah, I think you'd be doing well to get this past 17,000 feet. But if you're flying around at maybe 8,000 feet, this thing has pretty good performance, and it can, fly low and slow and stuff like that. So, if you're not necessarily into warplanes, but you want something that's good for kind of VFR and exploring, and is kind of fun to fly, then this affords quite a good view. And of course, the other advantage of it is that it's very maneuverable. So you can do that kind of thing if you want to, and throw it about. And it's a bit more exciting than a GA aeroplane for that kind of thing. And of course, you can do this, and you can, if I can get the upper gun to work somewhere up there. There we go. So we can shoot stuff if we want to. Anyway, let's bring this thing in for a landing. So remember what I said about assigning that ignition button. So I will demonstrate that with a landing. So we can get the throttle back, or we can keep the throttle forward, and then what we can do is we can use the blip switch. And if I use the blip switch now, and then back on, that's what you do. You tend to sort of like bring the thing in, cut the engine, and then hopefully get it back on, and then cut it, and then get it back on. Now then, what you probably want to do, which I did there, is you probably want to, as long as it's not going in a massively wild turn, you probably do want it to turn, because this thing does not have wheel brakes. Yeah, and so bringing it in for a landing, you if the thing does sort of turn a little bit, that's kind of a bit of an advantage. And ordinarily at this point, you know, if you'd landed in a field, some people would come out and grab the wingtips and help you taxi it in. But of course, we haven't got that option, but we can slew things and what have you. But you know, you could start the engine again and taxi it in if you want to. So there are some challenges in flying this thing, not least of which is learning the throttle and learning how to land it when you haven't got brakes, and learning how to taxi it when you haven't got brakes. But that's kind of fun, you know, and you can see that it is a very, very pretty aeroplane and not very expensive at all. Only just a little bit more than 10 quid for something that's very, very nice and a little bit different, and will let you throw it around. And if you go on multiplayer, you can have dog fights with people and stuff like that. So some good stuff. And as I say, very, very pretty, and even for a simple aeroplane, it's got some nice touches on it. If I was going to be picky about it at all, I would say that when that thing's streaming, when we're at when we're diving this thing and getting up to, I know, 120 miles per hour, and the scarf's going behind, I think it could flap about a little bit more. But other than that, I think this thing's really, really pretty. I think it's beautifully animated, really nicely textured. It flies well. It's good fun. It's good fun to land, good fun to take off, and a bit of a challenge to operate, especially with using that blip thing on there. You know what I mean? Not the best landing I've ever done, as I'm sure you're aware, but it requires you to sort of lose speed in the circuit and plan things kind of well. So there you go. The Big Radials Nieuport 17. Thanks to the guys at Big Radials for sending me this review copy. As I say, I've donated something to charity for the cost of it and what have you. So you did a good deed there as well. That's it for this episode of Chuck's Hangar. Check the link in the description for where you can get this thing if you're interested in it, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you like these kind of reviews, because there's more coming. I'll be doing another one I think the day after tomorrow. I do actually occasionally have to go out and work, so you know, it's probably only going to be a couple of days before there's another review on my channel anyway. In the interim, take care everybody, bye.